Let's begin with a cozy image in your mind. A peaceful bedroom, gentle candlelight flickering against the wallpaper, warm blankets tucked around you, and silence blanketing the night. Now take that image, crumple it like a Victorian love letter, and throw it straight into the nearest chamber pot, because the Victorian bedroom was anything but peaceful. If you thought bedrooms were private sanctuaries, think again. In the 19th century, sleep was not a solitary affair. It was a group activity like karaoke, but with less singing and more snoring. Privacy was a luxury most Victorians didn't have, and if you were poor, your idea of personal space probably extended as far as you could stretch your legs without accidentally kicking someone in the face. Hello, travelers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Tonight, we will explore the topic, why Victorian bedtime was weird, but weirdly genius, and many more. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. Let's talk furniture. A wealthy Victorian bedroom could resemble a miniature palace, four-poster beds draped with heavy velvet curtains, elaborately carved wardrobes, ornate dresses, and yes, if you were truly living the dream, your very own fireplace. A fireplace in the bedroom. That's peak luxury, unless of course it smoked back into the room and gassed you like a chimney sweep's bad day. But for the average Victorian, furniture was a mixed bag of functional, second-hand, and don't sit on that, it's haunted. The bed might have been made from cast iron if you were mid-tier, or plain wood if you were lower class. There were no IKEA nightstands or floating minimalist shelves. Everything was bulky, heavy, and slightly threatening. It wasn't stylish, it was just there. And then we come to the chamber pot. Oh yes, the humble ceramic or tin bucket that lived under your bed, waiting for your bladder to betray you in the middle of the night. No indoor plumbing? No problem, just relieve yourself into a pot, and hope no one trips over it on the way to their own 2 a.m. emergency. Now, here's where things get truly communal. Most families didn't have a room for every child, or even every pair of children. In working-class homes, entire families might cram into 1 or 2 rooms. Children shared beds, siblings piled in like logs, and sometimes, if things got really tight, you might even share with extended family, servants, or apprentices. Imagine tucking in for the night and saying, "Good night, Mum. Good night, Dad. Good night, Edwin, the blacksmith's assistant." If you were a servant in a wealthier home, you might be lucky enough to sleep in an attic or a cupboard under the stairs. And if you were really lucky, the rats wouldn't chew through your only pair of socks. Some slept in narrow cots, others curled up by the kitchen hearth. Privacy wasn't a right, it was a rumor. The good news? You're indoors. The bad news? So is everyone else, including Grandma the maid, and possibly a goat. That's not even a joke. In rural homes, it wasn't unheard of to have animals sleeping inside to protect them from the cold. Imagine drifting off to sleep with the gentle bleat of a sheep and the aromatic delight of livestock breath. Now, let's talk bedtime routines. Today's modern rituals include a skincare routine, perhaps some calming music, maybe a chamomile tea. The Victorian version? Wrestling with 14 layers of increasingly unflattering clothing while praying you don't dislocate a shoulder, unhooking your corset. Women had to remove chemises, petticoats, bustles, crinolines, corsets, blouses and skirts, each of which required at least one minor engineering degree. Men didn't have it much easier. Shirts with stiff collars, waistcoats, braces, trousers and boots that required the upper body strength of a prizefighter just to remove. Nightwear wasn't designed for seduction or comfort. It was made for warmth and modesty. Long nightgowns, flannel dressing gowns, and nightcaps were standard. Everyone looked like they were going to bed in character for a Dickens novel. You didn't slip into something comfortable. You got slowly entombed in it. Did we mention heating? Fireplaces were rare in average bedrooms. Central heating didn't exist. You might have a hot water bottle or warm a brick in the oven to keep your toes from falling off. But if you were poor, you just hoped the body heat from 6 other people and a mattress stuffed with hay would keep you from becoming a human popsicle. In many households, the bedroom doubled as a living space. You might eat there, sew there, argue there, or even host the doctor there. In fact, in-home births, deaths, illnesses, and every milestone in between often happened in the bedroom. It was the all-purpose space: hospital, lounge, nursery, and sometimes even the sick ward. Think of Victorian bedrooms as less personal sanctuary and more community sleep pile with occasional ghost sightings. So before we dive into the sophisticated world of Victorian sleeping habits, remember this: the very room where it all happened was crowded, uncomfortable, dimly lit, and smelled faintly of coal smoke and despair. But for millions of Victorians, it was home, and bedtime was only just getting started. Picture this. It's midnight. The fireplace has dimmed to a sleepy glow. Outside, the gas lamps hiss and flicker. Inside, a man in a long nightshirt yawns, tosses off the covers, lights a candle, and casually shuffles off to make tea. Welcome to Biphasic sleep, the Victorian two-part bedtime tradition that modern science is only just beginning to appreciate, and your sleep-deprived self might secretly envy. Before alarm clocks and 9-to-5 work schedules zombified our modern sleep, most people in the Victorian era and earlier didn't sleep straight through the night. Instead, they followed a two-sleep pattern: first sleep from around 9 p.m. until midnight or 1 a.m., followed by an hour or two of wakefulness. Then a second sleep until dawn. And the in-between time? It wasn't some insomnia crisis. It was just normal. Imagine waking up at 1 a.m. brewing tea, chatting about your day, maybe knitting a sock, and then casually going back to sleep like nothing happened. First sleep wasn't just a quick nap before pulling an all-nighter. It was the real deal. People would tuck themselves in after supper, usually around 9 p.m. or shortly after dark in winter months. With no streaming platforms or social media rabbit holes to fall into, there wasn't much else to do. Daylight was gone, candles were expensive, and the coal stove had already eaten half your wages. This first sleep typically lasted about 3 to 4 hours and was often the deepest, most restful slumber, the kind of sleep where you wake up confused about what century it is. Even doctors and medical writers at the time referred to first sleep as if it were as natural as breathing, and for a while it was. Today, if you find yourself wide awake at 2 a.m., it usually results in a desperate scroll through questionable internet forums or a search for melatonin gummies. But in the Victorian world, this waking period was expected and even productive. This hour or two of gentle wakefulness had a name in some circles: the watching hour. And it wasn't some silent, eerie ghost-hunting moment, although Victorians were into ghosts. Don't worry, we'll get to that in another chapter. People used the time to pray, read, journal, reflect, or tend to the fire. Married couples sometimes chose this window for more intimate reconnection, because nothing says romance like groggy candlelight and woolen underwear. In Victorian terms, your midnight snack was also your second shift, and yes, some people got up and made tea, others smoked a pipe, a few might step outside to stargaze. Occasionally, the particularly industrious would start small household chores, mending socks, knitting, or quietly chopping vegetables by lantern light, like a culinary bat. One of the biggest differences between then and now? No one thought this wakefulness meant something was wrong with them. There was no cultural obsession with 8 uninterrupted hours, no sleep trackers judging you, no frantic whispering to yourself, "If I fall asleep now, I'll get 5 hours. Okay, 4 hours. Oh no." This middle-of-the-night pause was built into their rhythm of life. It was considered peaceful. In fact, some religious thinkers of the time even praised this moment of quiet solitude as the perfect time to speak with God, free from the distractions of the day. After the middle wakeful period, people would tuck themselves back in and drift into second sleep, which lasted until dawn or whenever their responsibilities started calling: read, roosters, factory bells, or crying babies. This second sleep was lighter, often filled with more dreams. It gently carried people toward morning rather than abruptly ejecting them from unconsciousness like a malfunctioning alarm clock. For farmers and early risers, this second sleep might end by 5 a.m. For others, especially those who didn't have to clock into a textile mill. It stretched until full daylight. But either way, it created a natural division in the night that felt human. So what killed off Biphasic sleep? We'll get there later, but spoiler alert, it wasn't ghosts or night demons. The invention of artificial lighting, changing work schedules, and the Industrial Revolution's demand for regimented time slowly buried the two-sleep tradition under coal dust and factory whistles. But for the Victorians, this double sleep model made the night a lived-in place, not a blank stretch of darkness. It was full of quiet rituals, warm drinks, whispered prayers, and the occasional sock darning. Romantic? Maybe. Bizarre? Definitely. But oddly, genius. The sun sets, the sky turns a shade of charcoal, and in modern life the world doesn't miss a beat. Street lamps buzz on, phones glow, televisions light up the walls like mini-raves, and refrigerators hum like tiny backup dancers. But in Victorian times, when the sun went down, it meant something very different. You were on the clock, and your options for fighting the darkness were limited, flickering, and likely to burn your eyebrows off. Let's talk about Victorian lighting, the kind that didn't come with a switch but did come with a fire hazard. Lighting in the 1800s was not only scarce, it was also expensive. A simple beeswax candle could cost more than an entire loaf of bread. If you wanted the good stuff, the long-burning, clean, glowing kind, you were either rich or about to become broke. Cheaper alternatives like tallow candles were made of animal fat and produced smoke, odor, and the distinct impression that someone had lit a steak on fire in your hallway. Forget ring lights. Victorians had mood lighting whether they wanted it or not, and the mood was generally, I can't see my own hand. A single candle was often expected to illuminate an entire room. It didn't illuminate anything really. It politely suggested where the shadows might not be. If you were slightly better off, you might have had an oil lamp, which used whale oil, vegetable oil, or kerosene. These were more efficient than candles, but brought along their own charming risks, like unexpected explosions, persistent smoke, and the very real chance of igniting your ruffled nightgown. And unlike your smartphone flashlight, these sources of light did not come with a brightness setting. They had one mode, dim but determined. Still, in a strange way, this low-lit world created an atmosphere that modern bulbs just can't replicate. Candlelight softened every edge, both literal and emotional. Wrinkles blurred, clutter vanished into darkness, and no one could see the food crumbs on your blouse. It was nature's filter, long before Instagram caught on. Families gathered around a single lamp or flame, casting long dreamy shadows on wallpaper that may or may not have contained arsenic. Even the moonlight filtering through lace curtains became part of the nightly ambience, a free touch of silvery drama thrown in by the cosmos. But let's not get too romantic. Lighting was also a limitation, a firm, inescapable reminder that when the sun dipped, your usefulness did too. Productivity after dark became a luxury. Want to write letters, read a book, or do some late-night sewing? You'd better have a steady hand, a stockpile of candles, and zero fear of eye strain. Even medical professionals had to work with poor lighting. Surgery in the evening? Not unless you wanted to find out what surprise organ you'd removed. And heaven help you if you dropped something. If you dropped anything after sunset, whether it was a sock, a button, or your last ounce of dignity, congratulations, it now belonged to the darkness. You might as well say goodbye and move on with your life. It wasn't worth lighting an entire candle just to recover your spoon. That spoon was gone. That spoon had a new life now, beneath the bed, with the dust and the ghosts. The lack of artificial light also had a strange side effect. People's understanding of time was fluid. Without glaring clocks on the wall or digital readouts on every appliance, your sense of late and early was often based on candle length or just the angle of the moon. You didn't say, "It's 10:37 p.m., you said, "Well, the candle's halfway down and I can't feel my toes, so it must be bedtime." And yet, this dim, flickering world created something that modern life has largely lost, a natural invitation to slow down. Without blue light blasting melatonin out of your brain or television cliffhangers keeping you up until 2 a.m., the body and mind eased more gently into rest. Nighttime wasn't just a leftover part of the day, it was its own chapter, wrapped in hush and shadow. Sure, it came with soot-stained ceilings, the occasional scorched beard, and the need to squint at everything. But it also came with a kind of enforced calm, a reminder that the world didn't have to be brightly lit to be lived in, it just had to glow enough to keep the monsters away, and maybe help you find the teapot without setting the drapes on fire. So, while we sit here in our overlit homes with backlit screens, and enough brightness to simulate a small sun, it's worth remembering that Victorian nights weren't just dark, they were deliberately so. And while their lighting left much to be desired in the visibility department, it more than made up for it with ambience, shadows, and the constant thrill of not knowing if your sleeve might ignite. Let's be honest, today's pajamas are built for comfort, convenience, and just enough dignity to answer the door for a pizza. You might toss on a t-shirt, some stretchy pants, or nothing at all if you're feeling bold and thermostat confident. But if you were living in the Victorian era, sleepwear wasn't just an outfit. It was a battle strategy against cold, disease, and the ever-looming threat of looking improper. You didn't just get ready for bed, you suited up. Victorian sleepwear was less loungewear and more textile fortress. The goal wasn't to feel cozy while binge-watching something, it was to survive the night without freezing solid, offending modesty, or being mistaken for immoral. Pajamas weren't meant to express your personality, they were meant to prevent pneumonia. Let's start with the nightgown, the cornerstone of Victorian sleep couture. For women, this meant a long, voluminous garment, often reaching the floor, made from thick flannel or cotton, and featuring more buttons than a modern keyboard. It usually had long sleeves, a high collar, and enough room in the skirt to double as a parachute. Functional? Barely. Flattering? Only if you were aiming for ghostly silhouettes seen in a thunderstorm. Men didn't escape this fashion prison either. In fact, they wore gowns. That's right, gowns. Long nightshirts that looked suspiciously like dresses, except they came in manlier shades like oatmeal or sad sky. The patriarch of the house could strut around the bedroom in a floor-length shirt with his nightcap perched rakishly on his head, looking like someone who took a wrong turn on his way to a Charles Dickens cosplay convention. And let's talk about the nightcap, shall we? Not the fun alcoholic kind, but the actual fabric cone with a tassel on the end. These were worn to keep your head warm at night, because apparently the Victorian skull had all the thermal integrity of a colander. Nightcaps were floppy, embarrassing, and absolutely essential, sort of like those ridiculous holiday paper crowns, but with more frostbite protection and fewer crackers involved. For those living in draftier homes or during the colder months, which, spoiler alert, was most of the time, layers were stacked like geological strata. Over the nightgown, you might add a dressing gown, a robe-like garment worn for additional insulation. Some people even slept in their woolen stockings, or wrapped rags around their feet, hands and necks to avoid catching a chill, which Victorians believed was a direct route to death. Victorian pajamas weren't designed for sleep, they were designed for surviving a minor ice age. And if you thought the nightmare stopped at layers, think again. Some women wore corset-style undergarments to bed, believing it would preserve their waistline and keep their insides from rebelling overnight. Because nothing says restful slumber like being gently crushed for 8 hours. Others feared that completely removing the corset might lead to spontaneous body collapse, or worse, moral decay. So instead of undressing, they'd downgrade to a slightly less oppressive version, known charmingly as a sleeping stay. Not restful. Very committed. Children didn't get much of a break either. Tiny humans were bundled into full-body flannel contraptions, sometimes tied shut at the feet so they couldn't kick their covers off. Essentially, Victorian kids were swaddled like decorative loaves of bread, and expected to sleep without complaint while wrapped in wool and maternal anxiety. But none of this was about aesthetics. Victorian nightwear had a singular, non-negotiable goal: retain heat or perish. Central heating was a luxury very few had access to, so people used whatever layers, textiles, and awkward accessories they could find to trap warmth. There were no heated blankets, no fuzzy socks from the holiday aisle, just ingenuity, desperation, and a pair of elbow-length mittens that made turning the pages of your prayer book a full-contact sport. And let's not forget the occasional fashion fail. Falling asleep next to an open flame while wrapped in flammable cotton was always a risk. Those flowing sleeves and extra-long nightgowns could turn your midnight tea into an impromptu fire drill. And if you had to rush outside in an emergency, say to fetch a chamber pot or rescue the cat, you'd be doing it in a gown, a bonnet, and a look of sheer betrayal on your face. You didn't slip into something comfortable, you got slowly entombed in it. So while modern bedtime involves soft hoodies, heated blankets, and a mildly judgmental YouTube algorithm, the Victorian version was an all-out war against the elements and propriety. Every night you prepared not just for sleep, but for a quiet, dignified survival. Sure, you may have looked like a confused librarian from the 1600s, but at least your toes didn't fall off. At first glance, a Victorian bed might seem like a dreamy place, tall, stately, often carved with dramatic flourishes, and dressed in layers of lacy curtains. It looked like a cloud married a throne, but much like a haunted mansion or a suspiciously quiet toddler, beneath that charming exterior lurked something darker, itchier, and very much alive. Victorians didn't just go to bed, they entered a contract with chaos. Let's begin with the mattress. If you're imagining something plush, springy, and ergonomically designed to support your lumbar region, stop immediately. Victorian mattresses weren't engineered for comfort. They were assembled from whatever stuffing was available that week and wouldn't attract crows. Common fillings included straw, horsehair, feathers, or any softish material that hadn't recently belonged to a living rodent. Straw was cheap but noisy. One shift and your bed let out a crunch like you were napping inside a cornflake. Horsehair was stiff, wiry, and felt suspiciously like you'd offended a barber who took revenge using upholstery. Feathers could be heavenly until they started poking through the ticking like tiny stabby ghosts, and these were just the good options. Poorer homes might rely on moss, rags, or a pile of compressed despair stitched into sackcloth. And don't forget, you had to beat your mattress. No, not emotionally, literally, regularly. You'd take it outside and thrash it within an inch of its lumpy life to dislodge dust, fluff the filling, and evict any uninvited inhabitants. Speaking of which, let's talk bedbugs, or lice, or fleas, or any of the multitudes of Victorian roommates who did not pay rent. If you thought the real estate market was bad now, imagine being a blood-sucking insect in 1850, prime conditions, warm hosts, 0 pesticides and free meals all night. Beds were a 5-star buffet, and you were the entree. The good news, you're horizontal. The bad news, so are 10,000 tiny creatures who consider you the buffet. Entire families would go to sleep with a resigned sense of inevitability, knowing full well that by morning, at least one person would wake up scratching, and another might wake up missing an eyebrow, courtesy of a wandering flea circus. And let's not forget the bed-warming pan, a lovely metal tray filled with hot coals and slid between the sheets to make the mattress less frosty. Very cozy, also very flammable. One wrong move and you weren't just warm, you were done. Now if you were wealthy or just very dramatic, you might have slept in a 4-poster bed. These weren't just for show. Sure, they looked magnificent, like a stage for a tragic play about insomnia, but their real purpose was defense. The heavy curtains surrounding the bed helped retain body heat and keep out drafts. But more importantly, they helped keep things out like insects, rats, or the eyes of anyone else in the room, which, as we've covered, could include a small audience. Those curtains weren't optional decor. They were a privacy shield, a germ barrier, and a do not disturb sign all rolled into one. Want to change your nightclothes while your sister, your great-aunt and someone else's baby are also in the room? Pull the curtains. Want to keep flies off your face while you sleep? Curtains. Want to believe just for a moment that you're not sharing a sleeping space with 6 people and a bowl of onions? You guessed it, curtains. But even the fanciest bed couldn't protect you from the structural weirdness that was just baked into the design. Beds were often oddly short, not because Victorians were all hobbit-sized, but because many people slept sitting up, believing that lying fully horizontal could lead to bad digestion, fluid buildup in the brain, or depending on whom you asked, sudden death. So they'd prop themselves on pillows, sit at a tilt, and try to rest while looking like they were politely awaiting a guest. And don't even think about flipping your mattress casually. Some of these were tied with rope lattice underneath that needed regular retightening, like tuning an instrument no one wanted to hear. The ropes would sag over time, turning your bed into a human hammock that pitched and rolled like a ship on stormy seas. Sleep wasn't restful. It was a nightly survival challenge between the sagging ropes, the questionable stuffing, the insect population, and the risk of setting your nightcap on fire with a nearby candle. It's a wonder anyone got any rest at all. But somehow they did, night after night. Victorians crawled into their suspicious, creaky, bug-adjacent nests and tried their best to forget everything they knew about germs, pests, and smoke inhalation. So the next time you complain about your lumpy pillow or your mattress being a little too firm, remember, you could be lying on straw, wrapped in flannel, swatting at fleas, and praying your bed doesn't catch fire or collapse. Sweet dreams. In the Victorian era, sleep wasn't just a biological necessity, it was a moral performance. In a world where everything from how you dressed to how you held your soup spoon was under judgment, the timing and manner of your sleep became yet another arena where society, religion, and the creeping hands of industrialization all joined forces to shame you into conformity. The way you slept didn't just say, "I'm tired," it said, "I'm respectable," or conversely, "I am deeply flawed and possibly French." The Victorian obsession with morality didn't clock out when the sun went down. If anything, it doubled down. Early to bed wasn't just practical, it was righteous. The sooner you tucked in, the more virtuous you were perceived to be. Staying up late was associated with all the wrong crowds: gamblers, drinkers, prostitutes, poets. Anything past 9 p.m. was practically a moral crime. If you weren't asleep by 9 p.m., Victorians assumed you were sinning. There was even a semi-official bedtime for decent people. The working class, those who had to be up at the crack of dawn to shovel coal, milk cows, or operate terrifying factory machinery, were expected to sleep early out of necessity. But for the middle and upper classes, turning in early was a deliberate act of discipline and self-control. Night owls didn't just raise eyebrows, they triggered sermons. Religious leaders were especially fond of linking proper sleep with moral cleanliness. To them, the dark hours of the night were prime time for temptation. The devil, they believed, worked the graveyard shift. Staying up late made you more likely to drink, gamble, engage in improper behavior, or, heaven forbid, read scandalous novels by candlelight. Even dreaming came under suspicion. Some believed dreams could reveal sinful thoughts or worse, plant them. That's right. Victorian sleep was a battleground for your eternal soul. You couldn't just go to bed and call it a night. You had to go to bed properly, with God and Queen Victoria both silently nodding their approval from the shadows. Anything less, and you might as well tattoo "shameful libertine" on your forehead. But sleep wasn't just judged by when you got it. It was judged by how much you took. Sleep too long? You were lazy. Sleep too little? You were suspicious. If you woke at 10 about, palos minutes. Society assumed you were a layabout, possibly drunk, or recovering from a night of ungodly behavior. If you barely slept at all, maybe you were brooding about your many secrets, or plotting something unseemly like attending a poetry reading or thinking independently. Your sleep schedule wasn't a personal choice, it was a statement of character. This created a kind of social sleep anxiety. People monitored not just their own sleep, but each other's. Gossip over breakfast might include whispered judgments like, "Did you see when Mr. Wadsworth extinguished his lamp? Well past midnight, and he looked flushed." Suddenly, you weren't just tired, you were reputationally compromised. Of course, as with many things in the 19th century, class determined the rules. The working class were often granted more leniency, at least by necessity. If you spent all day hauling bricks or shoveling soot, nobody batted an eye if you passed out fully clothed at 8 p.m. But if you were of the higher classes, especially women, Your sleep behavior was scrutinized like your table manners and hemline length. Delicate ladies were allowed to nap during the day, resting one's nerves, they called it, so long as they did it demurely on a fainting couch, preferably while pale and clutching a lace handkerchief. Then came the Industrial Revolution, and with it, the ticking of clocks grew louder, literally and metaphorically. Factories didn't care about your dreams or nighttime prayers. They cared about punctuality. Mass production required strict schedules, which meant time became a tyrant, and sleep had to bend to its will. For the first time in human history, people were being forced to regulate their bodies around machines. You didn't wake with the sun anymore. You woke with the factory bell, the train whistle, or the sound of someone shouting, "If you're not out of bed in 10 seconds, you're fired." Sleep stopped being tied to natural rhythms and started revolving around productivity. This new rigidity infiltrated every class. Children were taught to wake up early like proper citizens. Workers were fined for being late. Employers tracked absences. Even spiritual leaders leaned into the new ethos. Early rising pleases God, they'd say, and builds nations. Late rising presumably pleased only Satan and maybe poets. In this climate, sleep hygiene wasn't about getting rest. It was about proving your worth. Being well rested wasn't trendy. Being efficient was. People began boasting about how little they slept, using it as proof of hard work, moral fiber, and in some cases, superiority. The idea that rest might be good for you? That was dangerously close to idleness, and idleness, according to Victorian wisdom, was the devil's beanbag chair. So next time you find yourself up late, sipping tea and watching owl videos at 2 a.m., remember, in Victorian times you'd already be under social investigation. Your bedtime wasn't just your business, it was everyone else's too. For the Victorians, nighttime wasn't just the end of the day, it was the beginning of a spiritual minefield. The moment the candle was snuffed out, the shadows weren't just shadows anymore. They were potential hiding spots for ghosts, demons, ill omens, and possibly the angry spirit of your Aunt Mildred, who died tragically of a chill. In other words, when darkness fell, so did logic, and the darkness, it was not your friend. You didn't just fear the dark, you respected it like an unpaid landlord. Victorians loved the spooky. This was the era that practically invented the Gothic novel. Ghost stories weren't just read, they were believed, whispered around fireplaces, and blamed for everything from creaky floorboards to sudden nosebleeds. The line between sleep and the supernatural was delightfully and terrifyingly blurred. If you woke up from a nightmare, the explanation wasn't, "Oh, I shouldn't have eaten boiled eel before bed." No, the more logical conclusion was that the devil had personally paid you a visit. One common belief was that evil spirits sat on the chest of a sleeping person, causing a sense of suffocation and fear, an experience now recognized as sleep paralysis. But back then, no question, that was a demon, possibly French. Having a nightmare wasn't a personal issue. It meant the devil probably sat on your chest. Victorian-era medical texts were full of polite panic about sleep disturbances, often describing dreams as portals to the subconscious, or worse, a report card from your spiritual hygiene. If your dreams were strange, violent, or erotic, gasp, you weren't just mentally unwell, you were morally suspicious. And then there was the terrifying invisible killer, known simply as night air. This was not a metaphor. Victorians genuinely believed that the air at night was unhealthy, even poisonous. Many refused to open windows after dusk, convinced that night breezes carried disease, madness, or at the very least rheumatism. If you cracked your window to cool off, your neighbors might assume you were either suicidal or a witch. Night air was especially feared in urban environments, where damp, foggy evenings were thought to spread cholera, typhoid, or whatever plague was trending that decade. The idea was that during the day the sun purified the air, but once it disappeared, boom, the air reverted to its natural state of evil fog soup. This paranoia led to heavy curtains, tightly sealed windows, and homes that essentially became slow-cooking steamers overnight. You weren't just sleeping, you were marinating in your own Victorian fears, which, ironically, probably did make it harder to breathe. But were people going to open a window and risk ghost-borne tuberculosis? Absolutely not. And let's not forget the orientation of the bed. Sleeping in the wrong direction wasn't just a bad feng shui choice, it was a spiritual hazard. Some Victorians believed your bed should face east-west to align with the sun's natural movement. Others said sleeping with your feet pointing north would invite death. A few insisted your head should never point toward the door because that's how corpses are carried out of rooms. Logical? Maybe not. But when the stakes are accidentally summoning a banshee, you play it safe. Superstitions around the bed itself were common too. Iron bed frames were seen as a way to ward off spirits thanks to the belief that metal repelled paranormal forces. Some even tied bits of garlic or religious medallions to the headboard, just in case something tried to sneak in while you were unconscious. Because what better way to get a restful night than by arming your bed like it's a holy fortress? In rural areas, beliefs got even more colourful. People worried about witches stealing dreams, or fairies sneaking in to braid your hair, or worse, steal your baby. To counter this, some folks would sleep with iron scissors under the pillow, place salt at the windowsill, or hang bells near the bed to scare off the invisible. It was less bedroom and more booby-trapped safe zone. Animals were also thought to be early warning systems for paranormal activity. If the family cat hissed at a corner, that wasn't dismissed, it was evidence. And dogs howling at night, clearly a spirit passing through, or possibly a tax collector. Either way, it wasn't good news. In short, the Victorian night was not just dark, it was spiritually loaded. Every creak of the floorboard, every shift in the wind, every shadow that danced against the wallpaper was pregnant with possibility, and rarely the fun kind. And if you were lucky enough to sleep straight through, well, you probably owed it to the strategically placed silver cross above your bed and the garlic bulb you hid in your nightstand drawer. So yes, Victorian sleep may have lacked blue light and TV shows, but it had something far more invigorating. The thrill of maybe dying in your sleep because your bed was pointing the wrong direction, or a ghost didn't like your hairstyle. Rest well. For centuries, the night was just that, night. When the sun dipped below the horizon, so did society. People lowered their voices, lit a candle, if they could afford it, and drifted into a rhythm shaped by firelight and moonbeams. But then came the unassuming hero of science, who would accidentally become sleep's most diabolical enemy, artificial light. First gas, then filament, then doom, and thus the villain enters, the humble light bulb destroyer of dreams, banisher of second sleep. Let's rewind to the early 1800s. Before electric lighting, the main artificial source of illumination came from gas lamps. They were revolutionary, yes, but they weren't gentle. Gas lights hissed, flickered, and turned entire rooms a murky shade of yellowish drama. More importantly, they made it possible for the first time in human history to push back the night with the flip of a valve. This changed everything. Shops could stay open later. Streets could be walked after dark. People could do the unimaginable, schedule meetings that started after sunset. It was progress, yes, but the kind of progress that came with consequences. And for sleep, those consequences came fast and glowing. The first thing to go, Biphasic sleep, that quirky, peaceful system of first sleep and second sleep that had defined human rest for generations. With artificial light blazing in the living room, people no longer felt the same pull to go to bed just after sundown. They could read longer, socialize later, and push first sleep further and further until it merged into one big slab of sleep, if they got any at all. Gone were the midnight hours of quiet wakefulness, prayer, sock mending, and tea. Now you were more likely to be debating politics under a gas sconce or flipping through the Victorian equivalent of celebrity gossip, which was probably just the Times. But the gas lamp was just the beginning, because then Thomas Edison happened, and with him came the light bulb, compact, bright, and less likely to explode than an oil lamp. Suddenly, anyone with a few shillings could flood their home with light at all hours. Bedrooms were no longer sanctuaries of darkness. They were just less convenient living rooms. The boundaries between day and night blurred like a bad watercolor painting. In the glow of the electric bulb, society began to forget what darkness felt like, and in doing so it began to forget what proper sleep looked like too. Victorian sleep died the same way many of us do, scrolling past midnight. Of course there was no scrolling back then, but there was a new cultural obsession: productivity. Industrialists, factory owners, and moralists all began preaching a gospel of hustle. Why rest when you could work? Why dream when you could produce? Light made it possible to squeeze more labor out of people, and more guilt out of those who dared to close their eyes too early. And so began the era of the rest is laziness mentality. The spiritual ancestor of your co-worker, who brags about sleeping 4 hours a night and still managing to run a 5K before breakfast. The same torch has been passed down through generations, from coal miners to startup CEOs, each one proudly torching their circadian rhythm for the sake of being efficient. Meanwhile, medical experts started worrying, some quietly, others very loudly. Doctors and scientists noticed that people were sleeping less, and that sleep disorders were on the rise. But by then the light bulb had burned its way into every home, office and factory. There was no going back. It wasn't just about having light, it was about having the illusion of eternal day. Why sleep when you could keep working, keep reading, keep cleaning, keep doing anything? Darkness used to be a full stop. Artificial light turned it into a semicolon. Rest optional, work encouraged. Even social expectations shifted. Staying up late became fashionable in some circles, proof that you were cosmopolitan, worldly, or romantically tragic. Poets and artists leaned into it. Parties stretched into the small hours. Coffee culture took root. Tea became an all-night affair, and the respectable 9 p.m. bedtime, it became something only your grandmother did, or worse, something the lower classes were still clinging to, out of necessity rather than style. And through it all, the poor body, your poor exhausted body, was just trying to figure out what happened. The natural rise and fall of melatonin got overruled by Edison's nightlight. Our internal clocks, once set to the sun and the moon, now danced to the glow of whatever was burning overhead. The human race was officially off the sleep grid. So while the invention of artificial light gave us opera at night, late-night snacks, and the modern concept of the evening, it also robbed us of something ancient and intuitive, the sacred rhythm of rest. Also, we could squeeze in one more hour of productivity, one more chapter, one more chore. Would Victorian sleep have survived without the light bulb? Maybe. But let's face it, once humans figured out how to turn night into day, they were never going to just go to bed quietly. We tend to look back on Victorian habits with a mix of fascination and concern. After all, these were the same people who thought arsenic made wallpaper more fashionable, and that fainting in public was a valid form of communication. But when it comes to sleep, yes, sleep, it turns out the Victorians may have been onto something. Beneath the corsets, chamber pots, and terrifying nightwear, they had a sleep pattern that modern science is now starting to validate. And no, we're not talking about bedtime seances or dream analysis as moral judgment. We're talking about biphasic sleep, the practice of sleeping in 2 distinct chunks with a wakeful period in between. The same thing you might panic about when you wake up at 2 a.m. and wonder if you're broken. Good news, you're not broken. You're just accidentally historically accurate. Turns out, lying awake at 2 a.m. thinking about snacks isn't a modern crisis, it's vintage behavior. Over the past few decades, sleep researchers have taken a long, hard look at how humans naturally rest, and the findings are surprising. In the 1990s, psychiatrist Thomas Ware conducted a study where he removed artificial light from people's daily routines. What happened? After a few weeks of adjustment, participants began sleeping in 2 blocks, about 4 hours of sleep, an hour or 2 of quiet wakefulness, and then another 4 hours of sleep. Sound familiar? This first sleep, second sleep cycle mirrors exactly what Victorians and earlier societies did on purpose. It wasn't insomnia, it wasn't poor sleep hygiene, it was standard human biology, a natural rhythm shaped over thousands of years when darkness actually meant darkness, and nobody was staying up to binge watch anything except maybe the stars. That hour or two in the middle of the night wasn't wasted either. Historical records show people used that time to pray, reflect, write in journals, tend to animals, visit neighbors, have a casual midnight chat with their spouse, or sneak in a snack. Far from being anxious about it, they embraced it as a second wind for the soul. It was like a bonus round of consciousness before slipping back into dreamland. In contrast, modern sleep culture is obsessed with unbroken sleep, one clean, uninterrupted stretch of 7 to 8 hours, or else you're a zombie with brain fog and bad skin. But science now suggests this might be more of a post-industrial ideal than a biological truth. Artificial lighting, alarm clocks, and a 24/7 world have trained us to expect linear, consistent sleep. Yet many people naturally drift into segmented patterns. And let's talk about melatonin, the hormone responsible for telling your body it's time to power down. In natural darkness, melatonin rises gently in the evening and stays elevated through the night. But artificial lighting, especially the blue light from screens, throws a wrench into this system. It tells your body, hey, it's still day. Let's make toast or reorganize the pantry. As a result, your sleep gets pushed later, becomes shallower and more prone to interruption. The Victorian dimly lit world may have been inconvenient for late-night embroidery, but it was great for melatonin. In fact, the modern obsession with fixing our sleep often ignores what might be a more forgiving, realistic pattern. Waking up in the night isn't necessarily a problem. It might be a feature, not a bug. The Victorians had no anxiety over this. They didn't reach for sleep apps, lavender sprays, or podcasts featuring whale noises. They simply accepted that the night came in chapters. Science, confirming that Victorians were weird and possibly smarter than us in their pajamas. Of course, we can't romanticize every part of Victorian sleep. Their bedding was infested, their night clothes resembled tactical gear, and they feared ghosts with a level of sincerity typically reserved today for IRS audits. But in this one area, the rhythm of human rest, they were strangely in sync with something we've only recently started to understand. Human sleep was never meant to be monolithic. There's something comforting about that. The next time you find yourself wide awake at 1:45 a.m. staring at the ceiling, wrestling with existential dread and craving toast, you can stop panicking. You're not failing at sleep. You're tapping into a long ancestral tradition of middle-of-the-night mindfulness, baked into our biology by centuries of rising with the sun and resting with the stars. And maybe, just maybe, the real weirdos are the ones who expect to pass out instantly at 10 p.m., remain unconscious for exactly 8 hours, and rise like a smiling productivity robot at 6 a.m., no tossing, no turning, no midnight snacks, just pure streamlined slumber. Honestly, that sounds suspicious. So yes, in a world full of electric light, alarm clocks and late-night email replies, perhaps the Victorians' nightcaps and all knew something we forgot. The night isn't meant to be rushed, it's meant to be lived in, even if just a little, one quiet hour at a time. So now that we've spent a whole hour unearthing the quirky, creaky, candlelit sleep culture of the Victorian age, complete with demon-induced nightmares, pajamas that doubled as insulation, and bedtime routines monitored by society's moral magnifying glass, you may be wondering, should I actually try this? Can you? A modern human armed with LED screens, noise-cancelling earbuds, and 3 streaming subscriptions, sleep like it's 1850? Well, yes and no. Let's get the big spoiler out of the way. Trying full-on Victorian Biphasic sleep in the 21st century is tricky. If you work a typical 9-to-5 job, have children, or live in a world where sunrise yoga exists, breaking your night into 2 luxurious chunks is about as practical as heating your house with coal and a strong moral compass. Victorians had the advantage of not being on the clock. Their daily schedules, while rigid in some ways, often revolved around natural light, local community rhythms, and let's be honest, the lack of Netflix. They weren't fighting late-night Slack messages or responding to emails at midnight. They were boiling water by candlelight and yelling at ghosts. But just because you can't fully replicate their sleep habits doesn't mean you can't borrow a few cozy ideas. The good news is that some elements of Victorian sleep culture were surprisingly smart, and science agrees. The bad news? Most of them don't involve wearing a wool nightgown or sealing your windows with moral panic. Try sleeping like a Victorian, but maybe skip the bedbugs and haunted wallpaper. So if you're looking to improve your modern sleep by borrowing a few tips from the past, here are some Victorian-inspired suggestions that won't require living in a time when antibiotics were just a hopeful stare. 1. Embrace the wakeful hour, if it happens naturally. Wake up in the middle of the night and can't fall back asleep right away. Don't panic. Don't reach for your phone. And for the love of melatonin, don't check your work email. Instead, try leaning into it. Read a book. Write in a journal. Do something quiet and restful, preferably not illuminated by 1,200 lumens of retina-searing blue light. Many sleep researchers now believe that trying to force unbroken sleep can cause more anxiety than benefit, so if your brain wants to hang out at 2 a.m., maybe give it some gentle company. 2. Dim the lights before bed. Victorians didn't have the luxury of forgetting to turn off the kitchen light. Their entire homes slowly dimmed as the candles burned down, naturally easing their bodies into rest mode. You can mimic this by dimming your lights an hour before bed, skipping overhead bulbs, and avoiding the cold, judgmental glow of your phone screen. Yes, we know social media is calling, but you can either listen to that or to your pineal gland quietly asking, "Can I make melatonin now?" 3. Bring back the bedtime ritual. Victorians had elaborate routines, brushing hair 100 times, sipping warm milk, whispering scandalous prayers, layering flannel with the urgency of a survivalist. While you don't need to wear a sleeping stay, establishing a simple routine, maybe tea, reading, stretching, or a warm bath, can signal to your brain that it's time to stop doom scrolling and start slowing down. And no, you don't need to wear a nightcap unless you want to terrify your pets. But if you do, we support you. 4. Get serious about darkness. Victorians weren't afraid of the dark, they were terrified of what was in it. But ironically, all those heavy bed curtains and shuttered windows created excellent sleep environments. Darkness tells your brain to knock out the cortisol and cue up the melatonin, so block out streetlights, unplug those glowing chargers, and make your bedroom the kind of pitch-black cavern that would make a Victorian ghost feel right at home. 5. Respect the clock, but maybe not that much. It's easy to get swept up in the productivity obsession that started in the Victorian age and never quite left. But just because the light bulb made 2 a.m. possible doesn't mean it made it healthy. Try to reclaim your rest not as something to squeeze in, but as something sacred like a nap, but with dignity. The real takeaway here isn't to replicate every part of Victorian sleep. We strongly advise against chamber pots and shared mattresses. It's to rethink how we define rest. The Victorians, for all their strange beliefs and superstitions, at least treated sleep as a real event, not an afterthought wedged between work emails and existential dread. So maybe the best way to sleep like a Victorian isn't to dress like one, or start praying at 1 a.m., or read ghost stories until your candle gives out. Maybe it's just about making space for rest, real, unrushed, unashamed rest, in a world that's forgotten what nighttime is even for. So tonight, dim the lights, put down the phone, wrap yourself in a blanket, preferably not 40 pounds of wool, and drift off knowing that if you wake up at 2 a.m., you're not broken. You're just channeling the inner Victorian in all of us, a little weird, slightly dramatic, and surprisingly completely human. Sleep tight. Don't let the philosophical fleas bite. Ahoy! So you've decided to sail the high seas in the Middle Ages. Congratulations, you've just signed up for a first-hand experience in nautical misery, claustrophobia, and the smell of 20 men who haven't bathed in months. Think of it as a luxury cruise, if the only thing luxurious was how quickly you regretted it. Let's start with your new home, the medieval ship. You know that romantic image you have in your head, billowing white sails, clean wood decks, and a crew that looks like they belong in a shampoo commercial? Yeah, scrub that image clean, preferably with lie and a plague doctor mask. Instead, welcome aboard your actual ride. Maybe a cog if you're early medieval. Think a floating bathtub with a single square sail, a carrack if you're fancy, and in the 15th century, big, bulky, and about as aerodynamic as a barn. Or a galley if you enjoy rowing until your arms fall off. Galleys were powered by muscle, which sounds impressive until you realize you are the muscle. Medieval gym memberships came with oars. Regardless of model, the ship you're on will likely be roughly the size of a basketball court, give or take, but with enough crew and cargo to fill a football stadium. Mostly wood, and not the clean, varnished kind. The creaking you hear? That's not ambience, that's the hull hoping it won't split open. Unstable, thanks to barrels loaded by Jeff the apprentice, whose sense of balance is worse than your last relationship. Every step on board is a reminder that safety regulations hadn't been invented yet. Life jackets? Never heard of them. Fire extinguishers? You're lucky if you have water that doesn't give you dysentery. If the ship catches fire, yes, that was a thing. The strategy is to panic very quickly. Where do you sleep? Anywhere you won't get stepped on. There's no personal quarters unless you're the captain or a merchant paying good money. And even then, privacy means a wooden curtain and maybe a bucket with a lid. The rest of the crew? They sleep on deck, below deck, or slumped against barrels of salted fish, which, plot twist, are often slightly less salty than the crew themselves. Your pillow is your rolled-up cloak. Your mattress is a splintered plank. If it rains, it's your shower and your curse in one convenient package. And shoes? Don't count on them. Leather rots in seawater. You're barefoot most of the time, which makes stubbed toes and rope burns your new best friends. The ship rocks constantly. There's no stabilizer. You will get seasick, and everyone will mock you for it. The seasoned sailors chew dried ginger root and keep their sea legs steady. You, the newbie, will vomit into a bucket, lose the bucket, and then discover that there's no such thing as a refund policy on this floating purgatory. Add in the sounds. Waves slapping the hull, the sail flapping, ropes creaking, and at least 3 people groaning in existential crisis. It's the soundtrack of medieval misery, and you're the newest member of the band. It's not just the ocean. No, that would be too merciful. It's the ocean plus rotting food, unwashed bodies, damp wood, bilge water. Look that up, but not while eating, and the general aroma of long-distance regret. It clings to your clothes, it gets in your hair, it becomes part of you, like trauma. And the animals. Livestock are often brought on board, chickens, goats, pigs, because preserving meat was a dicey business. So not only do you share the deck with 40 sleep-deprived sailors, but also a goat that's angry it can't lie down properly. Still picturing Pirates of the Caribbean? Stop it. You're not Captain Jack Sparrow. You're more like the guy in the background throwing up while trying to swat flies off his face. There's no sword-fighting elegance, no flirtatious banter, no bottles of rum. Well, maybe rum, but it's more like vinegar at this point. Instead, there are wooden mugs filled with questionable beer, a first mate with one eye and 2 opinions too many, and someone named Old Thomas who's been muttering to the sea since Lisbon. So yes, welcome aboard. Your dream of glorious adventure is about to collide with the reality of soggy boots, cramped spaces, and exactly 0 chances of a happy ending. But hey, at least you're technically traveling. Not well, and definitely not comfortably, but moving forward nonetheless. Just try not to fall overboard, because there's no turning back. Literally, this ship doesn't reverse. Step aboard, and meet your charming new roommates. About 50 other human disasters crammed into a space smaller than your local cafe's bathroom. If you thought a medieval ship was going to offer a relaxing getaway, you've clearly never been wedged between a flatulent cook, a nervous goat, and a guy named Alric, who hasn't blinked since the coast of Portugal. The medieval ship wasn't just a floating plank of misery. It was a social experiment in how many people you can fit into one wooden box before someone snaps. The answer apparently was just 1 fewer than what was actually on board. Your fellow passengers come from all walks of life, and by walks of life we mean people who walked directly into terrible life decisions. There's the seasoned sailor who's missing 3 fingers and thinks storms are romantic. There's the conscripted soldier who still doesn't know what war he's heading toward. There's a convicted thief serving out his sentence at sea, which was arguably more punishment than prison. And then there's you, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, and already wondering if you can fake your death and float home on a barrel. Some of the passengers are livestock, literally, cows, pigs, chickens. They get better sleeping spots than you do because they're considered valuable cargo. You're just considered replaceable. Now let's talk about sleep, or the activity formerly known as sleep. If you're one of the lucky few, you might get a hammock, an actual swinging bit of cloth suspended above the stench. But if you're not in the captain's favor, or you forgot to bribe the boatswain with your last piece of dried fruit, you're left with other options. The bare deck, which doubles as a footpath for everyone else. A coiled rope, which is comfortable until you wake up tangled and angry, or heaven forbid, the corner near the pig pen. If you sleep there once, you never stop smelling like it. There's no bedtime routine, no warm blankets, no lullabies. Your lullaby is the snoring of 10 different men in 10 different keys, and the occasional loud thud of a barrel shifting at midnight. If you have trouble sleeping at home, just remember medieval sailors solved that by being so exhausted from hauling ropes and vomiting that they could pass out mid-chew. But while everyone is equally sleep-deprived and damp, don't be fooled into thinking the ship is some kind of floating commune of equality. No, this is still medieval society, and hierarchy survives even in the middle of the Atlantic. The captain gets a cabin, with a door, a table, maybe a window if he's important enough. He eats salted meat, drinks wine, and writes stern entries in the ship's log about discipline and honor while occasionally sipping something that suspiciously smells like brandy. Below him are the officers and navigators, who might share a cramped room, but at least they're not sleeping next to a goat named Agnes. Then there's the rest of the crew. You, the deckhands, the unlucky conscripts. You eat hard tack, which is not in fact food. It's compressed flour, water and dreams baked until it's indistinguishable from roofing tile. It's so hard you don't bite into it, you just politely gnaw at it like a beaver. If you're lucky, it's only stale. If you're unlucky, it comes with a bonus weevil or two. But hey, protein, right? Meals are communal, but not in the wholesome sense. Picture everyone hunched in a circle fighting over whatever hasn't molded, while pretending they didn't see the rat that just sprinted over the biscuit pile. There are no forks, no napkins, and no real rules. The only consistent thing is that the captain eats first, the officers eat second, and you eat whatever's left, assuming the goat doesn't beat you to it. As for personal space, that's a fantasy. You're not just in each other's bubbles, you're basically sharing a bloodstream. Changing your shirt without elbowing someone in the face? Impossible. Escaping a conversation? Unlikely. Sneezing without causing a minor panic? Good luck. Privacy. The only room of one's own is if you fall overboard. And don't even think about romantic entanglements. There's no flirting when everyone smells like pickled despair and your best attempt at a love note is carved into a plank because paper doesn't survive here. The ship is a pressure cooker, and not the kind that makes tender meals. It's the kind that makes people snap because Sven won't stop humming sea shanties at 3 a.m. In short, your new roommates are loud, sweaty, underfed, and one small storm away from a mutiny. And you're now one of them. A human sardine, packed tight into a floating coffin of wooden walls and shattered expectations. Still excited about your medieval maritime adventure? Great, because we haven't even covered the hygiene situation yet. Welcome to the medieval ship spa experience, where the exfoliant is sea salt, the shampoo is rainwater, and the signature scent is Eau de Human Misery Timime. If you boarded hoping for any semblance of cleanliness, allow us to swiftly and unapologetically crush those dreams. Because on a medieval ship, hygiene isn't just optional, it's non-existent. Let's begin with the burning question. Where do you go when nature calls? The answer is simple and horrifying. Over the side. That's right. There's no latrine, no bucket and lid system, and certainly no friendly occupied sign. You just shuffle to the edge, hang off the side of the ship like a demented seagull, and hope you don't die doing it. This system works fine on a calm day, assuming you enjoy wind exposure and an audience. But in stormy weather, good luck. If the waves don't get you, your own poor aim might. There were no railings, just ropes, wood, and regret. One poorly timed wave and you could go from relieving yourself to being relieved of your entire existence. Medieval sailors had a saying, "Don't drink too much unless you want to swim with it later." They were only half joking, and bathing, forget it. Bathing at sea was about as common as mermaids. Water was precious, and fresh water even more so. You didn't waste it on vanity projects like washing your hair. Instead, you embraced your new reality, a sticky, gritty, salt-crusted version of yourself that steadily evolved into a human barnacle. Some hopeful fools would try to wash in seawater, but that only left you itchy, chafed, and somehow even more cursed than before. Soap wasn't standard gear, and even if it was, using it in the open sea was like watching your last hope dissolve and float away, which is exactly what it did. As for clothes, they followed a similar schedule. You put them on, and then you wore them until either the voyage ended or they fused to your skin. Laundry day happened when it rained, and even then, it was less about hygiene and more about, well, it's wet anyway. You'd strip down, wring your shirt in the rain, slap it against the deck a few times like you were summoning the dirt demons out of it, and hang it to dry where it would promptly get trampled by 6 guys hauling barrels. Smell was not a minor issue. It was the ship's main export. The scent of sweat, mildew, fish, rotting wood and bad decisions was so thick you could taste it, and if you thought you could get used to it, you were wrong. Your nose didn't adjust, it surrendered. Now let's talk about your shipmates, not the ones you wave at or share rations with. No, the other crew, the smaller ones, the ones living in your clothes and feeding off your misery. Yes, we're talking about lice and fleas. These guys were the real veterans of maritime life. They didn't need hammocks or hard tack. All they needed was your scalp, your armpits, and occasionally your soul. Everyone had them. Everyone. Even the captain, though he liked to pretend otherwise. And they were industrious little creatures. Lice laid eggs faster than you could scratch, and fleas travelled faster than gossip. One sailor gets infested, and within days the ship becomes a floating itch factory. And let's not forget the rats, who weren't just along for the ride, they were thriving. Rats on a medieval ship were more than passengers. They were pests, dinner thieves, and occasional protein sources, depending on how desperate things got. They nested in the food barrels, chewed through the sails, and generally made themselves right at home. Some sailors claimed rats knew when a ship was doomed before anyone else. If they started vanishing, it was time to panic. Others just got used to seeing them scurry over their boots and decided to name them. That's Nigel. He stole my biscuit and my will to live. All of this, the filth, the pests, the excrement overboard, created a vibrant petri dish of infection. Skin diseases ran rampant. Fungal infections were common. Wounds festered, not healed. And if you ever got a splinter, you'd better start composing your will, because there was a real chance that splinter could kill you. You might think surely they had some solutions. Well, sort of. Some sailors wore amulets or garlic to ward off disease, because in the absence of science, superstition fills the gap. Others just drank heavily and hoped alcohol killed everything inside and out. Spoiler, it didn't. And yes, you are warmer than expected, but before you celebrate that little victory, know this: that warmth is from the lice. They've settled in, made a home, probably thrown a party or two. So no, medieval sailors weren't dirty because they were lazy. They were dirty because the entire system was built on surviving dirt, not avoiding it. The ship was damp, overcrowded, disease-ridden, and unforgiving. Cleanliness was a luxury. Survival was the only hygiene standard that mattered. But hey, on the bright side, if everyone stinks, then no one can judge you for smelling like despair. Unless the goat smells better, then you've got a problem. Let's set the scene. You're exhausted, filthy, probably hosting a colony of lice, and now you're hungry. Ravenous even. Time to eat, right? Wrong, because on a medieval ship, the word meal is less about nourishment and more about negotiating terms with your digestive system. The truth is, sailors didn't dine, they endured. Every bite was a gamble. Would it fill your stomach, make you sick, or bounce off your teeth and take out a molar? The medieval maritime diet was an exercise in what happens when humans try to outlive their food supply and lose. Let's begin with the all-star of shipboard cuisine, hardtack, also known as ship's biscuit, sea biscuit, or the only food item legally classified as both a carbohydrate and a construction material. Hardtack was flour and water baked into a shape vaguely resembling bread and then abandoned in the oven until it resembled drywall. It was so hard you couldn't bite it. You gnawed at it, sucked on it until it softened, or smashed it with the butt of a dagger like a barbarian trying to crack a prehistoric nut. Some sailors soaked it in ale to soften it, which worked about 50% of the time. The other 50% of the time the biscuit floated there like a smug little raft, completely immune to liquid. It wasn't just food, it was a challenge. But the worst part, it came with passengers, weevils, tiny beetle larvae that liked to lay their eggs inside the biscuits and hatch mid-journey. The trick was to eat around the black specks or pretend they were extra seasoning. Some sailors even joked that if your biscuit didn't move, it was too stale to eat. One way or another, you were eating protein, just not the kind you wanted. Next up, salted meat. The term meat here is being used generously. What it really meant was meat boiled in salt, dried, packed in more salt, left to marinate in its own misery, and then stuffed into barrels for months on end. It came out of the barrel looking like it had seen things grey, limp, and somehow both slimy and dry. You had to soak it in water for hours just to make it chewable, and even then it tasted like salted regret. There were rumours of fresh food, onions, cheese, maybe even dried fruit, but these were rare, mythological beasts. If you saw an onion on board, someone probably won it in a bet or inherited it from a dead uncle. Most fresh supplies were gone within the first week of the voyage, and after that it was barrels all the way down. Those barrels, by the way, were both a blessing and a curse. Sure, they stored food, but they were also made of wood, stored in the hottest parts of the ship, and completely at the mercy of temperature, moisture, and rats with an appetite for irony. Meat went bad, biscuits got mouldy, ale turned sour. One day you had pork, the next day that same pork had transformed into something squishy and smelling like low tide. And yet the food was still served, because there were no other options. One sailor's "that smells funny" was another sailor's "guess I'm having soup now." Texture changes were expected. In fact, they were the only sign the meal was aging, like a cheese with abandonment issues. Let's not forget the liquid refreshment, water. If you had it, became stale quickly, turning green, tasting metallic, or developing mysterious floaters. So most sailors drank ale, low-alcohol beer, that was safer than water but just as likely to betray you. After a few weeks at sea, it too could turn into a kind of warm barley sadness. But at least it got you mildly buzzed enough to forget you were chewing on something with antennae. Some ships stocked wine or brandy, but those were reserved for officers and higher-ups. You were lucky if your drink didn't also function as a cleaning agent. Occasionally sailors made a fermented drink from leftover bread, water, and desperation. It worked if your only goal was to forget the last meal happened, and when food ran low, things got darker, portions shrank, fights broke out. People started eyeing the ship's cat like it was a walking drumstick. Sailors joked about stew nights when no one knew exactly what was in the pot, and no one wanted to, but you ate anyway. Because starving at sea wasn't a poetic metaphor, it was a real possibility. So you gnawed the hard tack, chewed the questionable meat, drank the warm ale, and prayed you didn't see it all again in the waves 10 minutes later. And if it all went south, at least the hard tack doubled as a flotation device, assuming you had the teeth left to hang on. So bon appetit. Dining on a medieval ship was less about flavor and more about survival. If you could walk away from a meal without crying or bleeding, that was considered a culinary win. So you've survived the ship's claustrophobia, the lice spa treatment, and the culinary trauma that is hardtack stew. Congratulations. Your reward? Scurvy, the sailor's classic, the body's final act of rebellion, the disease that whispered, "Remember fruit?" Neither does your bloodstream. Scurvy wasn't just common at sea, it was practically part of the job description. Long before vitamins had letters, and even longer before anyone cared what C stood for. Spoiler, citrus, sailors slowly fell apart like cursed action figures, and it wasn't subtle. This wasn't a "maybe I'm coming down with something" kind of illness. This was a full-body meltdown in slow motion. It often started innocently enough. Maybe you felt tired, but then you noticed your gums were looking angry, swollen, red, and prone to bleeding at the mere suggestion of chewing. Then your teeth, not to be outdone, began to loosen. One by one, conversations turned into horror shows, with sailors talking mid-sentence only to have a molar casually exit their mouths like it had better things to do. Your joints stiffened, your legs ballooned, old wounds mysteriously reopened, bruises appeared like you owed your own body money. You'd look down and think, that's new, and then realize your skin was now auditioning for a zombie film. You weren't just ill, you were visibly decomposing while still technically alive. And all of this, as we now know, was caused by one simple, curable, ridiculously preventable thing: a lack of vitamin C. That's it. The same stuff you casually find in orange juice and gummy bears today was once the gatekeeper between life and becoming a puddle of human sadness. But in the medieval and early modern periods, nobody knew this. Sailors weren't vitamin deficient. They were just unlucky. Instead of packing lemons or limes, shipmasters loaded barrels of meat, hard biscuits and ale, but no fresh produce. Because who needs fruit when you can have a crate of salted cow sadness? Now, you might be thinking, surely someone figured it out early on. Oh, sweet summer child. It took centuries. For a while, people blamed scurvy on bad air, bad water, laziness, homesickness, or just the ocean being mean. One theory claimed that sleeping on damp sails caused scurvy, which was only slightly less ridiculous than blaming moonlight or angry mermaids. So what did they try as a cure? Oh, buckle up. Some captains ordered vinegar shots because if your teeth are falling out, let's add acid. Others tried mustard seeds, beer-soaked bread, or magic root mixtures that sounded more like potion ingredients from a questionable wizard. One brilliant mind suggested boiling horse bones into jelly, because when you're desperate, gelatin becomes a food group. Perhaps the most tragic cure of all came from a Dutch surgeon in the 17th century who recommended urine, drinking it daily. Not because it worked, of course, but because after you've spent months eating weevil crackers, what's a little pee between friends? The British Royal Navy eventually got it right in the 18th century. Yes, it took that long. A Scottish naval surgeon named James Lind conducted one of history's first clinical trials on actual scurvy-ridden sailors, no less. He split the crew into groups and gave each a different cure. The group given citrus fruits practically danced back to life while everyone else continued dissolving like damp bread. Lind's findings were promptly ignored. For decades, it wasn't until the late 1700s that lemon juice became a standard issue on British ships, earning British sailors the nickname limeys. And while that might sound like a weak insult today, it was a badge of survival back then. If you were a limey, you still had teeth. Meanwhile, other navies scoffed at the idea of fruit as medicine. The Spanish and Portuguese often relied on superstition. The French flirted with sauerkraut. And the Dutch? Well, they still had those vinegar barrels. God help them. Scurvy was so prevalent, it even dictated how long a ship could safely travel. If a voyage lasted more than a few months without making port or raiding someone else's fruit supply, crew numbers dropped dramatically. Not from battle, not from storms, but from fruitlessness. Literally. The disease didn't discriminate. Captains, officers, deckhands, everyone was fair game. Some ships reported death rates of over 50% on longer voyages, all because nobody thought to pack a few oranges. You could circumnavigate the globe but be taken down by the nutritional equivalent of forgetting to pack a lunch. And if all this sounds terrifying, just remember, if your breath smells like death and your teeth fall out mid-sentence, congrats, you're winning at scurvy. Bonus points if you've got leg ulcers and a general sense of despair. Thankfully, we live in an age of multivitamins, smoothies and emergency oranges. But back then, the ocean wasn't just vast and dangerous, it was a citrusless wasteland, and your gums knew it. By now, you've accepted that life aboard a medieval ship is essentially one long panic attack with the occasional biscuit. You've learned that food betrays you, your teeth are staging a mutiny, and personal hygiene is something you only read about in fairy tales. So what could possibly make things worse? How about a ship-wide infestation of creatures that didn't pay rent, didn't contribute, and definitely didn't respect personal space? Welcome to life with the uninvited passengers, rats, weevils, lice again, cockroaches, and any number of insects you didn't know existed, but will absolutely meet up close and personal by day 3. These weren't just nuisances, they were your new bunkmates, your dinner companions, and occasionally your dinner. Let's begin with the rats, because oh boy were they the MVPs of medieval maritime freeloading. You could find rats just about everywhere. Below deck, inside barrels, between ropes, in your blanket, and sometimes just staring at you with the confidence of someone who knew they ran this ship. And in a way they did. Rats weren't just tolerated, they were practically residents. They snuck aboard while ships were docked, and once they were in, good luck getting them out. They bred like, well, rats. A few rodents at the beginning of a voyage could become a full-blown rodent republic by the time you crossed the next sea. And they weren't shy. If you were asleep, they might climb over you. If you were awake, they might still climb over you. You learned to accept it. If you didn't sleep ever again. Even worse, the rats ate everything. Your food stores, gone. Your leather shoes, chewed. Your dreams of a pest-free voyage, devoured like a snack. They were masters of finding the last crumbs in the darkest corners, and could gnaw through wood like they were auditioning for a medieval lumberjack competition. But here's the real kicker. Sometimes they were dinner. Yes, it's true. When food ran low, and let's be honest, it always did, some sailors turned to the four-legged invaders for nourishment. The logic was simple. If it fits in a stew pot and runs slower than you, it's now meat. Rat stew wasn't glamorous, but it had protein, texture, and the bonus feature of fighting back when you tried to catch it. Of course, not everyone was a fan of rats. Enter the ship's cat, a rare and revered creature. Cats were some of the only animals aboard that earned their keep. They hunted rodents, kept the population somewhat in check, and occasionally provided emotional support whether they meant to or not. If your ship had a cat, you treated it well. In fact, the cat often had more respect than most of the crew. No one messed with Whiskers. Whiskers had claws and a job title. Now let's shift focus to a more subtle menace, weevils. These tiny beetles were the kind of pest that made you wish for the good old days of rat droppings. Why? Because weevils loved biscuits, and since you were eating hardtack for every meal, guess what was also getting fed? That's right, your daily bread came with extra protein. Tiny holes in the biscuit were a bad sign. Movement was worse. And if you bit into a biscuit and it crunched a little too much, congratulations, you've just met your first weevil. There wasn't much you could do. Some sailors tapped their biscuits on the table to knock the bugs out. Others closed their eyes and powered through. After a while, you didn't even notice. You just pretended the weevil was a particularly nutty grain and moved on with your slowly unraveling life. Infestations didn't stop there. Cockroaches thrived below deck, crawling out from under barrels like miniature nightmares with antennae. They loved dark, damp corners which unfortunately described 90% of the ship. They were impossible to kill, which was doubly frustrating because they had the gall to be ugly and invincible. Even the sails weren't safe. Insects nested in the folds, the ropes grew mold, the walls developed a healthy crust of grime, and every day you discovered a new species that hadn't been named yet, but was definitely trying to get into your boots. The truth is, sailors didn't have time to worry about it. Most just accepted the constant crawling, scratching and rustling as part of the soundtrack of life at sea. Complaining did nothing. Reporting it to the captain, good luck. He had his own rat problem, usually involving the barrel under his bunk. Some tried to keep pests away with charms or herbs, because medieval logic said lavender might scare away a determined rat. Others set traps, simple contraptions made of string and desperation, but mostly, sailors just pretended not to see what was skittering across their blankets. And if you think you are alone in your misery, think again. Your bunkmate might be a rat, or 3 rats in a trench coat pretending to be a man. Either way, you'd still sleep closer to them than to your own sense of dignity. So yes, you're stuck on a creaky ship surrounded by men who snore, biscuits that crawl, and rodents who treat your bed like a timeshare. And somehow the most disturbing part is that you get used to it. But don't worry, the weather will get worse and the gods of the sea haven't even had their tantrum yet. So far, you've endured lice, rats, biscuits with a crunch that shouldn't be there, and an overall vibe of prison but wetter. But if you thought life at sea was mostly about suffering in small doses, let's add weather to the mix. The medieval ship's favorite way to say, you thought you had control. That's adorable. Back in the Middle Ages, sailors had 0 modern navigation tools, no GPS, no satellite forecasts, no kindly voice reminding them to reroute due to severe thunderstorms. Their entire meteorological toolkit consisted of looking at the sky, sniffing the air, and guessing. Maybe the old boatswain said his bunions were acting up, which meant rain was coming. Maybe the clouds looked angry. Either way, you sailed straight into storms because nobody knew where the storms were until they were on top of you. Sometimes you saw a giant wall of black clouds and thought, should we go around it? Too bad, the wind already decided for you. Sailing into a storm on a medieval ship was not a hold onto your hat situation. It was more like hold onto the mast and scream into the void. The moment the skies darkened and the wind started howling, the mood shifted from cranky resignation to existential panic. These ships weren't designed to withstand much. Certainly not towering waves and sideways rain. A single misstep by the helmsman, or a snapped rope from Jeff. You remember Jeff, the guy who misloaded the barrels? Could turn the ship into a floating coffin. Sails tore like wet parchment. Rigging snapped and whipped around like angry snakes. Water poured over the deck, turning it into a deadly slip and slide of despair. The ship tipped and groaned, as if it was considering giving up entirely. Buckets were no match. Prayers were louder than the thunder, and at least one guy always swore he saw a sea monster right before vomiting into his boots. And if you were lucky enough to survive the storm, congrats, you're now cold, soaked, terrified, and sleeping in a puddle. Possibly your own. But fear of the storm wasn't just practical, it was spiritual. This was a deeply superstitious era, and sailors believed storms were the gods' way of showing they were bored and looking to spice things up with a little casual drowning. You weren't just afraid of bad weather, you were afraid of anger from above or below, or all directions really. Sailors would offer frantic prayers to saints, sea deities, or literally anything they thought might stop the ship from being flipped like a pancake. Sometimes they even threw offerings into the sea, food, coins, once even a goat, just to appease the watery powers. And then there were the rules. Oh, the glorious, irrational, oddly specific rules meant to prevent storms. Rule 1, no whistling. Seriously, whistling was believed to summon the wind and not the good kind. If you dared whistle on deck, expect to be tackled by 6 angry sailors and accused of conspiring with the sky. Rule 2, no women aboard. Not because of logistics, not even because of distractions, because women were thought to tempt the sea gods, who were apparently very jealous, dramatic types. A single woman on board could anger the waters, as if Poseidon were just sitting there pouting because you brought Susan. Rule 3, no red-haired sailors. Why? No reason, just vibes. If you had red hair, it was considered bad luck unless you were the first to board. People might avoid eye contact with you during bad weather, or try to make you apologize to the clouds. And if that sounds ridiculous, consider this. These rules were all people had. When you're clinging to a wooden beam while a wave the size of a house comes barreling at you, you'll believe in just about anything. Storms weren't rare either. Depending on the region and season, your voyage could run straight into squalls, tempests, or full-blown apocalyptic sea tantrums. The Mediterranean had sudden gales, The Atlantic had mood swings, and the North Sea, let's just say it had an attitude problem. Once a storm began, your strategy was simple: pray, then cry. Then pray harder, because crying wastes water, and you couldn't afford to waste anything. Not when the ocean was trying to climb on board like it paid for a ticket. Sometimes ships capsized, sometimes they ran aground, sometimes they simply vanished, and no one back home ever found out what happened. They just assumed the crew sailed off the edge of the earth, or got eaten by sea serpents, or possibly angered one too many weather gods with their off-key whistling. And the scariest part? If you survived one storm, there was no guarantee you'd survive the next. The sea didn't care about your track record. You weren't its guest. You were its chew toy. So next time you watch a storm from your cozy living room and think, wow, that's some weather, remember, a medieval sailor watched that same sky and thought, time to meet my maker again. Picture this. You're stuck on a cramped, creaking medieval ship for weeks or even months. You've survived the lice, rats, storms, biscuits with more legs than ingredients, and you're slowly losing your teeth to a vitamin mutiny. Naturally, you ask yourself, but what do we do for fun? And the answer is, not much. Entertainment on a medieval ship wasn't about joy, it was about distraction. Anything that pulled your mind away from the fact that you were floating in a wooden bathtub of despair was considered a win. If you could find something, anything, to make you forget the smell, the endless horizon, or the pig that wouldn't stop staring at you, you latched onto it like your sanity depended on it, because it did. First up, music. The original therapy before therapists were invented. Some sailors sang sea shanties, rhythmic songs that helped them work in time, pass the hours, or drown out the sound of the guy next to them crying. Sea shanties weren't elegant ballads. They were rough, repetitive, often bawdy verses about women in distant ports, ships that sank, and diseases you can't unhear. The lyrics weren't family-friendly, but then again, neither was the ship. If a sailor had an instrument, maybe a fiddle or a pipe, he instantly became the most popular man on board. Not because he was good, but because he was a noise that wasn't groaning wood, or someone vomiting into a bucket. Music was communal, loud and barely in tune, but it was better than nothing. It helped crews feel like humans instead of salt-encrusted zombies. Then there was gambling, the time-honored tradition of losing what little you owned to a man who made up the rules as he went. Dice were common, often made from bones, sometimes human, probably don't ask. And sailors would huddle in dark corners betting everything from buttons to extra rations to promises they never intended to keep. The stakes: a swig of ale, a slightly less mouldy biscuit, or the right to not swab the deck tomorrow. But games weren't just about fun, they were survival mechanisms for morale. As long as the crew was gambling and laughing, they weren't punching each other over who coughed on whose blanket. Of course, boredom is a powerful, dangerous force, and after enough days staring at an empty horizon and listening to snoring and seagulls, sailors got creative. There were strange competitions, spitting contests, often wind-adjusted, crab watching, when one mysteriously appeared on board, or rat racing, in which you did not want your lunch bet against the wrong rodent. Some men carved tiny sculptures from rope or wood. Others told stories, tall tales involving sirens, sea monsters and ports they probably never visited, but described in suspiciously specific detail. And then came the boredom-fueled brawls. Because when you trap a bunch of unwashed, underslept, overworked humans in close proximity, someone's going to snap. Maybe it was over who stole the last dry cloth. Maybe it was about a cheating dice throw. Maybe someone just didn't like Sven's whistling. And remember, that was also considered summoning a storm, so it's double offensive. Whatever the reason, punches flew, teeth got chipped, pride was bruised, and then things returned to normal like nothing happened. Occasionally, the crew entertained themselves through elaborate pranks, ranging from mildly annoying to career-ending. One classic: convincing a newbie that the ship had a secret underwater viewing window. It didn't. Or that if he climbed the mast and kissed the flag, he'd get better rations. He wouldn't. These were the medieval sailor version of hazing. equal parts cruel, hilarious, and deeply indicative of a crew with too much time and too few hobbies. And then, of course, there was drinking. Ale was the staple, and if it wasn't sour, they drank it. If it was sour, they drank it faster, before it got worse. Drunken sailors were equal parts entertainment and chaos generators. Singing turned to shouting, dice games turned into philosophy debates. No one remembered in the morning. And somehow someone always ended up trying to race a barrel across the deck. It never worked, but it always ended in laughter or splinters. Still, for many, the default entertainment was simply staring at the sea, lost in thought, regret, or a general feeling of why did I do this to myself. It was meditative, in a bleak, soul-numbing kind of way. Others carved bits of wood into tiny figures. Some wrote letters they'd never send. Some just muttered to themselves, replaying memories of land, food that didn't crunch unexpectedly, or beds that didn't rock like drunken cradles. Because at the end of the day, when your biggest thrill of the week is not being eaten by a shark or falling overboard, your entertainment standards change. You stop craving excitement and start yearning for any moment that doesn't involve vomiting, praying, or running from airborne barrels. So yes, entertainment on a medieval ship was real, but it was less a TV show, more try not to lose your grip on reality. And if all else failed, you could always scream into the ocean. It didn't help, but it felt honest. Cue the trumpets, raise the tattered flag. After weeks or months of enduring storms, starvation, lice, weevils, existential despair, and that one guy who never stopped coughing ominously, you've finally spotted land. You weep, you cheer, you kiss the deck, you promise to never go near salt water again. Surely now, at long last, the suffering ends. Spoiler. It doesn't, it just gets more creative. Stepping off a medieval ship was like finishing a marathon and then immediately being punched in the face by the city you just arrived in. You were exhausted, sunburned, emotionally shattered, probably missing a few teeth, and your clothes had developed their own weather patterns. But hey, you made it. The only problem? So did every disease you picked up along the way. Medieval sailors weren't exactly spreading joy and good hygiene. They were often patient zero for whatever exotic plague the ship had cooked up during the voyage. Remember all that moldy food, rat pee, and unidentifiable water? Yeah, your immune system remembers too, by failing. Many sailors stepped onto dry land only to collapse from dysentery, scurvy-related infections, or something new and exciting that had evolved in the cargo hold. And if it wasn't disease that got you, it was colonial awkwardness, that magical moment when you realize the new world is full of people who already live there and are not thrilled that you've shown up waving a flag and sneezing everywhere. Many expeditions arrived under the cheery banner of exploration, but what actually happened was a mix of diplomatic fumbling, violent misunderstandings, and massive cultural collisions. Best case scenario, you're ignored. Worst case, you spark a conflict by stepping on sacred ground or sneezing on a local chieftain. Oh, and did you think you'd get to relax now? Stretch your legs? Maybe nap in a real bed that doesn't sway with the tides? That's adorable. Instead, you might be drafted into a spontaneous war, conscripted to build a fort, or assigned to carry heavy things through mosquito-infested jungles while your captain confidently assures you, "This will all be ours soon. You barely survived the ocean, and now you're playing real-life risk with swords and no understanding of the terrain." In many cases, the death toll actually increased after landing. Sailors who survived months at sea only to die in the first week ashore became a running theme in maritime history. You might arrive with 100 men and lose half of them to local illness, poisoned water, hostile environments, or friendly fire. And that's assuming no one immediately wandered off and got eaten by something they didn't believe in until it was too late. And even if your mission wasn't military or colonial, say, you were a trader or worse, just tagging along for adventure, the reward waiting on shore was often a new kind of misery. You'd spend days unloading cargo, hauling supplies, negotiating with shady middlemen, or worse, preparing for the return voyage. Yes, after all that, you had to go back. And guess what? The rats were waiting. But let's say you were lucky. Let's say you didn't immediately contract jungle rot, get drafted into a conflict, or fall into a pit of colonial politics and scorpions. Even then, you were probably broke. Most sailors were paid at the end of a voyage, if at all, and if your ship's finances went sideways, they usually did, your payment might be delayed, reduced, or replaced with promises of glory, exposure, and maybe a free mug. Some crews were never paid at all. Captains blamed the crown blamed pirates blamed storms. Meanwhile, you're bartering your boots for soup and wondering if your toenail is supposed to be that color. And of course, the lucky few who did survive, got paid, and made it back home, had one final shock waiting. No one missed you. You were gone for months, maybe a year. Your old job was taken, your girlfriend married your cousin sold your house, and your dog doesn't recognize you anymore. Congratulations, you survived the ship. Now get ready to die in an entirely new way. Because the end of a medieval sea voyage wasn't a triumphant homecoming. It was just another terrible beginning. Whether it was new diseases, foreign conflicts, bureaucratic disasters, or just plain bad luck, life after the voyage proved that sometimes the journey wasn't the hard part. It was the prize at the end. But hey, at least you'll have stories, and possibly a cool scar, assuming you're still conscious. So before you romanticize the age of sail, picture this. You, bloated from salted meat, covered in rat bites, dragging a barrel of goods through an unfamiliar port, while wondering if that rash is new or just more visible in daylight. The ocean may have spared you, but the shore has other plans. And with that, landlubber, you've completed your voyage. You wouldn't survive a day on a medieval ship, and you probably wouldn't survive the landing either. Bon voyage. Long before the GPS gently scolded you for missing a turn, humanity had another way of getting lost with style, the compass. But don't let its sleek needle and mystical north-pointing power fool you. The compass's early history is less about direction and more about delightful confusion. And it all began with a rock that could find its way home better than most sailors could. We start in ancient China, where innovation met magnetism during the Han Dynasty, around the 2nd century BCE. There, scholars discovered something called lodestone, a naturally magnetized mineral that seemed to have a preference for pointing in a specific direction. While most people would see a rock and think, something to stub my toe on, the Chinese looked at it and thought, this rock is clearly magic and possibly useful. Priorities. They initially didn't use it to explore oceans or find new continents. Oh no. Instead, the early compass was used in feng shui and fortune-telling, because obviously if a rock points north, it can also tell you whether to rearrange your furniture. These early devices were sometimes spoon-shaped lodestones placed on bronze plates, where the spoon would align itself mysteriously, and everyone would go, ooh. It was more spiritual GPS than anything practical. Fast forward to the Song Dynasty, 960 to 1079 CE, and things start getting a little more navigational. Chinese scholars and mariners began using floating needles or lodestones suspended in water bowls, which sounds less like sailing equipment and more like something your aunt uses during a full moon to predict if Mercury is in retrograde. But despite the vibe, it worked. These floating compasses became useful for maritime navigation, helping ships traverse cloudy seas when the stars were taking a day off. Now, how did this amazing little gadget go from Chinese fortune-telling to European, let's accidentally discover new continents? That's where the world's greatest communication device, trade and conquest, kicks in. Through a mix of Silk Road interactions, Islamic scholarship, and possibly a few borrowed inventions, the idea of the compass drifted westward like an unmoored ship. Enter the Arab and Islamic scholars of the medieval period, who didn't just preserve ancient knowledge, they supercharged it. In the 11th and 12th centuries, Islamic navigators began describing devices that clearly resembled compasses, referring to them in texts and sometimes using them alongside astronomical instruments to help with both navigation and prayer direction. You wouldn't want to accidentally face Cleveland instead of Mecca. They applied mathematics, cartography, and actual brain power to the idea. In short, They understood that this wasn't just a mystical rock, it was a magnetic rock with ambition. Eventually, word of this device made its way to medieval Europe, a place where anything unfamiliar was often greeted with suspicion, superstition, or the firm belief that it was the work of the devil. So when sailors started pulling out magical needles that pointed in one direction no matter what, Europe had questions. Were these tools reliable? Were they safe? Would they burst into flames if you used them near a monastery? Nobody really knew, but let's give credit where it's due. While Europe initially saw the compass as a strange foreign artifact, they were desperate. Navigating Europe's foggy, overcast, storm-prone waters with just the stars and your cousin's guesswork was going poorly. Enter the compass, with its steady little needle that pointed north consistently, quietly, and frankly smugly. Still, for a long time, no one really understood how it worked. It wasn't until much later that magnetism was properly explained. In the meantime, theories abounded. Maybe the compass aligned with the pole star. Maybe it worked because of mystical earth energies. Maybe it was, in fact, an enchanted relic left behind by sea witches. Whatever the theory, the important thing was that it pointed somewhere which was better than nowhere. And as more ships adopted this pointy marvel, a revolution began, not because they suddenly knew where they were going, but because they now had the illusion that they did. And if there's one thing sailors needed, it was confidence. Also dry socks, but mostly confidence. In a world without road signs, lighthouses, or decent maps, a device that pointed reliably in the same direction was like having a slightly sarcastic friend say, "You're still going the wrong way, but at least you're consistently going that way." And sure, early compasses weren't perfect. They didn't account for magnetic declination. They could be thrown off by nearby iron, and occasionally they just spun around uselessly like a drunk pigeon. But even with those flaws, they were better than trusting Carl, the navigator who once got lost in his own town during daylight hours. So there it was, a magnetic miracle born in ancient China, refined through Islamic science, and nervously accepted by medieval Europe. The compass didn't just change navigation, it changed the world. It let people get lost in entirely new places. And next we'll explore just how hilariously bad navigation was before the compass came along. Because if you thought things were rough with it, you won't believe the pre-compass era of let's follow that bird and hope it's not suicidal. Before the compass elegantly wobbled its needle toward magnetic north, medieval sailors had another, more primitive navigation system, vibes. And by vibes we mean a mysterious mix of guesswork, folk wisdom, natural signs, and a whole lot of blind optimism disguised as confidence. It was the maritime equivalent of asking your friend who's never been to Paris to lead the road trip there using only his gut feeling and the shape of the clouds. Navigation in the pre-compass world was less of a science and more of a very elaborate ritual sacrifice of logic. For starters, let's talk about one of the most respected methods of finding your way, the stars. Sailors used constellations like Polaris, the North Star, to orient themselves, which sounds romantic, until you realize this only worked on clear nights. And if you've ever been near the sea, you'll know the sky is often more cloud than celestial, which meant if your life depended on spotting a specific twinkly dot in the sky, you'd better be good at praying or squinting. On cloudy nights, or worse, during the day, sailors had to rely on wind direction, wave patterns, sea color, bird activity, and the general mood of the ocean. If the waves were choppy, they assumed a storm might be coming. If seabirds flew west at dawn, they might be near land. If the water was turning green, maybe they were in shallower areas. And if nothing was happening at all, that was called panic. But the real star of pre-compass navigation was the sun. Using a basic understanding of where it rises and sets, mariners could roughly determine east and west, very roughly in the way a raccoon might determine where the garbage is by sniffing the air and making an educated guess. The process was full of error, but to the average sailor it was good enough, especially if you could blame someone else when it went wrong. In fact, most medieval voyages included at least one person who claimed to be a navigator. He would use things like dead reckoning, which is as ominous as it sounds. It meant you guessed your speed, estimated how far you'd traveled, and hoped the ocean wasn't lying. And the ocean always lies. You'd count the hours, maybe tie knots in ropes to track distance. This is where knots as a speed term came from. And then mutter something about heading southwest by westish, and hope no one asked for clarification. But oh, the mistakes. Entire expeditions were launched in the wrong direction. Sailors intending to reach Ireland ended up in Iceland. Those bound for Spain found themselves staring at Morocco with mild terror. Sailing west often meant sailing somewhere that is definitely not west, but looks pretty enough to claim. One of the most infamous navigation failures comes from Norse sagas. The Vikings, who were among the most daring pre-compass seafarers, supposedly used sunstones crystals that helped locate the sun's position on cloudy days. Whether or not this actually worked is debated, but let's be honest, if you're using a shiny rock to find your way through Arctic waters, you've either mastered ancient physics or you've gone full wizard. And even when land was finally spotted, sailors couldn't always tell what land it was. With maps that looked more like fantasy drawings than real geography, crews would cheer at the sight of France, only to realize 3 days later that it was just another island they didn't know existed. Then they'd name it something regal like Sankt whatever, plant a flag, and promptly get lost again. All of this led to some spectacular maritime disasters. Entire fleets disappeared because they misjudged their course. Ships ran aground on rocks because the water looked deep, and sometimes captains would follow flocks of birds or floating logs, assuming they knew something the humans didn't. Spoiler, they didn't. This high-stakes guessing game meant that most long-distance voyages were essentially long-distance survival challenges. You stocked your ship with food, water, and whatever courage you could scrape together, then pointed the bow somewhere and hoped the stars, the wind, and your uncle's sea stories would get you there. And here's where we circle back to the most important rule of pre-compass sailing: blame the cook. When things went wrong, and they always went wrong, somebody had to take the fall. Was it the navigator who read the stars upside down? The captain who misjudged the wind? Of course not. It was the cook. Obviously. Because if the bread is moldy and you're 400 miles off course, clearly the man boiling potatoes is cursed. In short, medieval navigation before the compass was a chaotic blend of instinct, half-remembered lore, and we've come this far stubbornness. It was a system where being almost right could still lead to drowning, and being confidently wrong was just the beginning of a new accidental empire. So let's imagine it's the 13th century. You're a European sailor. You've just finished yelling at the sky for sending another storm, and now you're squinting at a new gadget that claims to always point north. It's small, it's shiny, and it appears to move on its own. Naturally, your first thought is witchcraft. Welcome to the charming moment when the compass, already in use for centuries in China and embraced by Arab navigators, finally floated into medieval Europe, and in classic European fashion, the initial response was a mix of deep suspicion, confusion, and religious finger-pointing. Because in medieval Europe, if something worked and you didn't know why, it was clearly powered by the devil or some guy named Greg who read too much. You see, medieval Europe had a deeply complicated relationship with science, especially the kind that wasn't officially sanctioned by monks, scripture, or divine visions. So when sailors and scholars encountered a tool that could point north without being told to, it didn't feel like progress, it felt like sorcery. A needle floating or suspended in a box that aligned itself with an invisible force. If it wasn't in the Bible, it was probably from hell. In fact, early compass users were often secretive about it. Captains and navigators might hide the device, consulting it privately like a cursed mirror or a rebellious teen with forbidden love poetry. You didn't pull out a compass at the pub and say, "Check this out," unless you wanted someone to dunk you in holy water and set your house on fire. The church, always eager to weigh in on new technology it didn't invent, wasn't thrilled either. Some clerics claimed that the compass disrupted divine order after all. If God had wanted you to know where north was, he'd have put a big sign in the sky, not hidden it in a spinning bit of metal. There were even debates among scholars about whether using a compass for navigation on the Sabbath was sinful. Apparently, nothing says moral crisis like trying not to die at sea on a Sunday. Then there were those who argued that the compass's abilities were too precise to be natural. Since Earth's magnetic field wasn't exactly common knowledge in 13th century Europe, people suspected the compass worked by other forces, dark ones. Some believed demons whispered to the needle, steering sailors toward doom. Others thought the north held mystical powers, possibly a gate to heaven, or more likely, something horrifying involving frozen monsters and angry Norse ghosts. And don't forget the sailors themselves. These weren't exactly men of reasoned scientific debate. The average deckhand already lived in a world full of omens, sea monsters and deeply held beliefs about what color shirt made you sink faster. So when a captain pulled out a compass and said, "Trust this needle more than your instincts," many crew members responded with, "Yeah, no thanks, Satan." There were reports of crew mutinies over compasses, especially when the needle acted strange, like spinning randomly during a storm or pointing at magnetic rocks and causing everyone to believe the ship was being hunted by a sea witch. Those who did embrace the compass early were seen as either brave pioneers or dangerous lunatics. If a voyage ended well, they were geniuses. If it ended with a shipwreck or a cargo full of spoiled wine, well, burn the sorcerer was still on the table. Some navigators were forced to defend their compass use in court, or explain themselves to the church, which always makes for a fun day at work. Interestingly, the spread of the compass was slow, not because it didn't work, but because people didn't want to believe it did. There's a kind of poetic irony in humanity discovering a device that could literally show the way, and then spending decades saying, "No thanks, I prefer being wrong." But eventually, skepticism gave way to necessity. Maritime trade was expanding. Kingdoms were desperate for spice routes and gold, and the idea of sailing without dying became very trendy. Compasses became more common, especially among the more daring explorers who figured that if they were going to fall off the edge of the earth, they might as well do it in the right direction. Over time, compass use became standardized. It was included in ships' navigational kits kept near the helm, and eventually treated less like a demonic curiosity and more like a mildly judgmental co-pilot. But that journey from cursed tool to essential equipment took centuries, and not without some serious side-eyes and a few heresy trials. So yes, when the compass first met the West, it wasn't embraced, it was interrogated, feared, hidden, and occasionally hurled overboard mid-sailor panic. Because in medieval Europe, even a helpful needle could be suspicious, especially if it pointed somewhere you didn't want to go. By the time the compass finally secured a spot in the sailor's toolkit, nestled somewhere between desperation and a barrel of salted fish, Europe was itching to expand its horizons. And nothing says unearned self-assurance like handing someone a compass and a wildly inaccurate map, and then telling them, "Go find India." Welcome to the age of exploration, a glorious era of ambition, misadventure, and monumental wrong turns, now with magnetic guidance. With the compass on board, explorers like Christopher Columbus, Vasco da Gama, and Ferdinand Magellan set out to conquer the oceans. And while they still had absolutely no idea where they were half the time, at least they could say it confidently while heading in a vaguely consistent direction. Let's be clear, the compass didn't suddenly turn these sailors into GPS-equipped geniuses. It simply gave them the ability to be wrong with unwavering certainty. If you thought the world was shaped like a lumpy pancake, and that Japan was just a few days west of Portugal, the compass wouldn't stop you. It would just help you sail straight into the wrong conclusion. It was the ultimate enabler of bold delusion. Take Columbus, for example. With a pocket full of royal funding and an ego larger than the Atlantic, he sailed west in 1492, convinced he'd reach Asia. He used his compass faithfully, and he did discover land. Unfortunately, it wasn't India, or China, or anywhere near either of them. But did that stop him from calling the locals Indians and declaring success? Of course not, because the compass said he was going west, and that was good enough for government work. Then there's Vasco da Gama, who managed to actually get to India by going the long way around Africa. The compass played its role here, helping him hug coastlines, dodge storms, and sail into completely unfamiliar territories. with the kind of confidence only available to men in oversized hats. Sure, he had no clue what was waiting around each cape, but the needle kept pointing in the same direction, and in a time when most navigation involved guessing based on bird migration, that felt like magic. And we mustn't forget Ferdinand Magellan, the man who set out to circumnavigate the globe and prove definitively that Earth was round, which people mostly already knew, but it's fun to make a point. Armed with compasses, maps, and raw determination, Magellan's fleet embarked on a voyage so long and brutal that only one ship and 18 men survived it. Magellan himself did not. But the compass? Oh, the compass made it the whole way. It didn't save Magellan, but at least it pointed north while he heroically died in the Philippines. But the truth is, even with compasses, navigators still relied heavily on dead reckoning, which, if you've never tried it, is a method of determining your position by calculating speed, direction, and time. It's a bit like trying to find your way through a corn maze with a stopwatch and a very loud parrot shouting estimates. And in the 15th and 16th centuries, dead reckoning often led to the dead part being a little too literal. Why? Because maps at the time were optimistic works of fiction, more fantasy novel than cartographic tool. Unknown coastlines were decorated with sea monsters, mermaids, and judgmental-looking compass roses, and distances were based on best guesses, rumors, or the musings of a guy who once stared at the horizon too long. That's why the compass, while helpful, could only do so much. It told you which direction you were heading, north, south, east, west, but not what you were sailing into. And very often what you were sailing into was disease, mutiny, or several hundred miles of completely uncharted regret. Still, the compass gave explorers one critical advantage, a psychological edge. There's something powerful about having a device that at least pretends to know where it's going, even if every other tool fails, even if your maps are lies, your stars are hidden, and your crew is eyeing you like dinner. The compass needle keeps doing its tiny dance toward magnetic north. That kind of consistency was rare. And when you're on a wooden ship in the middle of a watery void with nothing but salted pork and rising panic, even a lying needle feels like a friend. It's worth noting that during this time, compass technology improved too. European mariners developed the dry compass with a needle mounted on a pivot, allowing for steadier readings even in rough seas. Eventually, the card compass, where a paper compass rose was attached to the needle, made it easier to read direction, even as your ship pitched like a drunken goat. But these improvements didn't change the core experience, being slightly less lost than usual. So yes, the compass did not help explorers know where they were, but it did help them be wrong in style, wrong in the same direction, and wrong all the way to new continents. It turned the vast unknown seas into slightly less mysterious question marks, and in an age where boldness often outranked knowledge, that was more than enough. The compass was a revolutionary tool. It gave direction, it inspired confidence, it helped people boldly go where plenty of other people had already accidentally washed up. But despite its needle-sharp promises and unwavering north-pointing glory, the compass wasn't perfect. In fact, for a lot of sailors, it was a very sophisticated way to crash slightly more efficiently. Let's talk about magnetic declination, the invisible, sneaky menace of early navigation. Declination is the angle between magnetic north, where your compass points, and true north, the actual geographical North Pole. This might sound like a minor issue, unless you're, say, trying not to hit land at full speed in the dark. Depending on where you are on the planet, that little angle could throw your entire course off by hundreds of miles. And back in the day, nobody handed sailors a declination chart and said adjust accordingly. Instead, it was more like, it's still pointing upish, so we're probably fine. Spoiler, they were not fine. Add to that the joy of iron interference, which early navigators discovered the hard way. See, when you bring iron tools, chains, anchors, or say an entire ship made partly out of metal near a magnetic needle, that needle gets twitchy. It starts pointing not toward the magnetic north, but toward the forge where Sven is fixing a nail. Some compasses would swing wildly when brought near cannonballs, blacksmith's tools, or even an overly enthusiastic iron-buckled boot. This meant your compass could cheerfully direct you straight into an iceberg, while firmly claiming, "Trust me, I know what I'm doing." And even when the compass worked technically correctly, human beings remained predictably the weakest link. Many ship captains simply ignored the compass altogether, convinced their years of experience and their incredibly wrong hunches were more reliable. One particularly spicy flavor of maritime disaster was when the compass pointed north, but the captain pointed east and said something like, "Nonsense, the sun rose there yesterday." Sometimes sailors would actively argue with the compass like it was an insubordinate crew member. "You dare defy me, needle? Mutiny, I say." There's a delightful historical tale of an English expedition in the 16th century where the crew, convinced the compass had been cursed, chucked it overboard and chose to trust the skies instead. By the time they washed up somewhere unplanned, sunburnt and out of ale, the skies had been no help and the compass had probably washed ashore thinking, "Well, I tried." Then you have stories of compasses malfunctioning mid-voyage, not because of ghosts probably, but because of careless handling. A jolt to the box, a poorly secured card, or a magnetized nail in the wrong spot, and suddenly the north needle is pointing suspiciously toward the pantry. Some crew members would even accuse the compass of being possessed if it spun in circles during a storm. To be fair, if your ship is being tossed like a salad in hurricane soup, the compass doing pirouettes might be the least of your problems. There were also those who, in moments of despair or high drama, just gave up on the compass altogether and decided to follow animals. Sailors had long believed that certain birds knew the way to land, so if the compass seemed confusing, they'd just track a seagull or albatross and hope it wasn't flying to nowhere. It's unclear how often this strategy worked, but given that some birds just wander over open ocean for fun, it's safe to say not often. One legendary anecdote comes from a crew in the 17th century who, upon realizing the compass needle had stopped moving, assumed they'd reached the edge of the world. Instead of investigating, they prayed, panicked, and tried to turn the ship around, only to realize later that someone had left a large iron anchor leaning against the compass box. The moral? Never underestimate the navigational havoc caused by someone named Bernard who just wanted a nap and didn't think about magnetism. And even when sailors finally understood the limitations of the compass, declination, interference, and operator error, they still managed to crash spectacularly, because again the compass only told you where you were pointing. It didn't warn you about reefs, storms, pirates, or the island full of people who were very unimpressed by your flag. So yes, the compass was a game changer, but it was not idiot-proof, demon-proof, or Bernard-proof. It required skill, understanding, and a bit of humility. Three things that were often missing from crews sailing the high seas with more rum than reason. As one might say, if your compass points north and your ship points toward a reef, congratulations, you've reached your final destination. By the 16th and 17th centuries, the compass had earned its place aboard nearly every European ship. But make no mistake, it wasn't treated like a humble navigation tool. It was more like the ship's unofficial deity, revered, feared, and locked away like it might cast a curse if someone sneezed too close to it. In an age where thunder was still occasionally blamed on God's bowling night, the compass was mysterious enough to inspire awe and full-blown superstition, especially among sailors who already believed the sea had a personal grudge against them. First things first, who got to touch the compass? The answer was often no one except the captain. The ship's compass was typically stored in a box, cabinet, or gimbaled housing, sometimes locked and kept in the captain's cabin or nailed near the helm. It wasn't just a practical move to prevent it from flying overboard in a storm. It was a recognition of its almost sacred status. On many ships, looking at the compass without permission could earn you anything from a verbal slap to being lashed to the mast for needle gazing. And this wasn't just the captain being territorial. The entire crew shared the belief that the compass could be angered. Bumping it, mocking it, or even pointing at it with greasy fingers could invite bad luck. If the needle started twitching weirdly, say during a storm or when the ship passed over iron-rich rocks, panic didn't take long to brew. Sailors might whisper, "It's cursed," while the captain muttered something about magnetism, and tried to sound convincing with absolutely no formal understanding of physics. It didn't help that the compass sometimes did act suspiciously. A sudden storm might make the ship lurch and the needle spin, or someone would hammer a nail too close to the box, and suddenly north pointed directly at the galley. When this happened, there were two options: calmly diagnose the interference, or, more popularly, assume someone angered the sea gods and must now be sacrificed. This led to incredible tension on board. If things went south, literally or figuratively, the compass became the flashpoint. Did the storm hit because Billy leaned too close to the compass? Did the needle spin because Tom the cabin boy insulted Neptune again? Was the ship cursed because someone used the compass box to rest their grog mug? Mutiny was never far behind. Compass-related panic could spark everything from screaming matches to full-blown revolts. If the voyage was already cursed with bad weather, low food, and the constant sound of rats plotting in the shadows, the crew was just waiting for a reason to yell, "The captain's lost his mind, oh yow!" And nothing screamed dangerously incompetent, quite like a compass pointing in circles while the captain insisted, "We're making good time." One account from a 17th century Dutch voyage tells of a mutiny that began because the helmsman claimed the captain had hexed the compass by looking at it upside down and laughing. Whether this was true or just sea-induced madness doesn't matter, the crew believed it. The captain had to be locked in his cabin until the compass calmed down. Spoiler, it didn't. Turns out the ship was sailing past a natural magnetic anomaly, but try explaining that to 60 men who think thunder is punishment for swearing. To protect the compass and their own necks, many captains developed elaborate rituals. Some ships insisted that the compass be fed daily with prayers or a splash of wine. Others wrapped the box in cloth, believing the darkness kept it humble. A few particularly jittery crews refused to use the compass at night, fearing its powers were stronger under the moon, and not in a good way. Sailors also developed taboos around the compass that went far beyond logic. You didn't whistle near it. Whistling summoned storms. You didn't step over it. That was an insult. You didn't place it next to garlic, onions, or religious relics, don't ask. And above all, you never ever let a woman near it, because apparently sea voyages weren't dangerous enough without misogyny thrown in. Ironically, the person most expected to understand and protect the compass, the navigator, was often the least trusted when it malfunctioned. Explaining Earth's magnetic field to a bunch of dehydrated men who hadn't bathed in weeks was like giving a TED talk to an angry goat. You see, it's all about magnetic flux lines, you'd begin, only to be interrupted by someone sharpening a knife and muttering, "Flux this." But despite all the superstition, despite the chaos and the occasional compass-inspired fistfight, the needle kept doing what it did best, pointing mostly north. And whether sailors believed it was powered by demons, angels, or something in between, they clung to it like a lifeline, because even if it led them into storms, onto reefs, or straight into the middle of nowhere, at least it gave them something to follow. It began as a trembling bit of lodestone floating in water, a strange artifact used by ancient Chinese fortune-tellers to divine the future. And somehow, across centuries and continents, it ended up clipped to a car dashboard next to an air freshener shaped like a pine tree. This is the improbable, wandering, magnetically charged journey of the compass, a device that once inspired mutinies and whispered superstitions, and now sits quietly in your smartphone app list between Candy Crush and your step counter. After centuries of confusion, suspicion, and navigational chaos, humanity finally got a grip on the science behind the spinning needle. By the 18th century, the compass had officially graduated from mystical sea demon to scientific instrument, all thanks to that magical substance known as understanding. As people began to comprehend magnetic fields, declination, and interference, the compass went from arcane curiosity to the backbone of global exploration. In other words, it stopped being scary and started being very useful, like fire, but less flammable. The earliest improvement came in the form of the dry compass, a needle mounted on a pivot rather than floating in water. It was easier to read, more stable, and slightly less likely to slosh around like your dignity after a storm. Later versions introduced a compass card, where the needle was mounted under a rotating rose printed with cardinal directions. Sailors could now glance down and read NNE instead of just roughly that way, I think. Confidence levels soared. Shipwreck rates did not drop quite as fast. Then came the marine compass, housed in a gimbaled box that kept it steady on even the choppiest waters. Some were even lit with oil lamps so you could admire your impending doom in the dark. These were so critical to naval success that ships would often carry multiple backups. After all, you couldn't blame the cook forever. But the compass didn't stop evolving. Enter the 19th and 20th centuries, where electricity started getting involved, and suddenly compasses weren't just magnets, they were circuits. The gyro compass emerged, using the Earth's rotation to find true north, without relying on magnetic fields. Then came digital compasses, tiny silicon miracles that lived inside satellites, aircraft, and eventually your watch. The same device that once caused sailors to burst into tears now sits next to your flashlight button, quietly judging your sense of direction. Of course, the modern compass isn't just a tool, it's a symbol, a romantic one, a little emblem of wanderlust. Flit through travel brochures, adventure novels, or motivational Instagram accounts and you'll find it. A stylized compass rose paired with a quote like, "Not all who wander are lost." Spoiler, most of them are. The compass has become a metaphor for journey, for inner guidance, and depending on the font choice, for regrettable tattoos. But let's not forget that it also represents centuries of glorious miscalculations. It was the gadget that guided Columbus to the Bahamas when he thought he was in Asia. It gave false confidence to explorers who would then confidently declare, "We've discovered a new continent," only to be informed by the locals, "You've discovered my backyard." It turned north into something magical and slightly dangerous. The first step on a path that could lead to riches, death, or more likely a fever and some regrets. And even today, the compass still shapes how we interact with the world. You may not be crossing the Atlantic in a wooden death trap anymore, but your GPS wouldn't work without compass-based orientation systems. Google Maps, that glorious little blue dot that spins when you don't know which way to walk, that's compass-powered. And while we like to pretend we're so much smarter now, the truth is we still get hopelessly lost just digitally. Because yes, today's compass might live inside your phone alongside high-resolution maps and turn-by-turn voice directions, but does that stop you from taking the wrong exit 3 times in a row because you swear the app meant the other left? No. No, it does not. You may no longer fear the wrath of sea gods or believe that iron can curse your voyage, but you'll absolutely ignore the compass app while driving 40 miles in the wrong direction just because you felt like it was east. So here we are, from lodestone bowls to dashboard ornaments, the compass has had a glow-up unlike any other. Once shrouded in mysticism and suspicion, now it sits in your pocket, waiting to be ignored in favor of gut instinct and vibes just like old times. The legacy of the compass isn't just about technology or travel. It's about humanity's endless desire to go somewhere, even if we have no idea where that is. The compass never stopped people from getting lost. It just made sure they could do it with flair, and that in the end is its true gift, giving us the courage to journey into the unknown confidently, inaccurately, and with a story to tell.